Mexico, from the Omecs to the Aztecs, by Dr. Michael Code and Rex Kunz. Chapter 2 Early Hunters. High on the flanks of the hills fringing the Valley of Mexico are clearly visible remains of beaches left by the Great Lake which once covered much of the valley. From these alone, it would be obvious that rainfall conditions in the distant past were very different from what they are today, or even from what they were in Aztec times. A close study of pollen from weather-sensitive plants recovered from deep cores have revealed that many thousands of years ago the amount of annual precipitation was very much higher, and that it has drastically declined since then. To understand such changes, we must go back in time more than 2 million years. Then, for reasons still under debate by geologists, the generally warm and humid climate of the globe suffered a profound alteration, and the Pleistocene, or Ice Age, was initiated. Temperatures dropped, and vast quantities of snow were deposited on the ever-rising mountain masses of far northern latitudes, to turn into massive ice sheets that ground their way south over much of northern Eurasia and North America. There were numerous glacial advances in the Pleistocene, separated by long interglacial periods during which more moderate conditions prevailed. In more southerly regions, such as Mexico, which actually lies with the tropics, such advances of the northern ice are believed to have been reflected by pluvials, that is, by rainy, cool periods interspersed with dry intervals. Hence those relict beaches in the Valley of Mexico. While the broad outline of what happened during the late Pleistocene in the New World is becoming clearer with every new discovery of very early artifacts and sites, it is still not established exactly when humans first entered this hemisphere. Even the how is now controversial. The last major stage of the Pleistocene, the Wisconsin in North America, began around 50,000 years ago and continued with many fluctuations until 10,000 years ago. Because their water was taken up into ice, the oceans of the world during the advances of the late Wisconsin were 200 feet or 60 meters lower than they stand at present, sufficiently exposing a platform to form a land bridge at least 1,000 miles or 600 kilometers wide between Siberia and the western coast of Alaska. Although an enormous sheet of ice then covered much of North America as far south as the Great Lakes of today, the land bridge was ice-free, as was western Alaska and the Yukon Valley. Many of the earliest migrant hunters into America would then have crossed from Asia through a tundra-covered, treeless, cold region, covered with a thin and patchy snows in winter, and inhabited by small herds of woolly mammoths, horse, bison, and other ungulates. Archaeologists have divided broadly into two camps over the date and mode of entry of these earliest Americans. One camp firmly believes in a short chronology, that the first movements into this hemisphere from Asia could only have taken place when there was a land bridge in place. This would have been drowned by rising sea levels beginning about 10,000 years ago, and that this occurred no earlier than 14,000 to 16,000 years ago. The other school holds to a long chronology, pointing to far older, if often disputed, radiocarbon dates than this for early human remains in the hemisphere. The argument regarding the land bridge put forward by the short chronology school only holds weight if boat travel was unknown in the world during the late Pleistocene. Yet early humans had reached Australia, which was never connected to the Asiatic mainland by a bridge, by 50,000 years ago, surely by boat. This raises the possibility of perhaps equally early migrations into North America, although there is yet no evidence for them. All the early skeletons that we have from the early hunter stage indicate that these peoples were ancestral American Indians belonging to the great Mongoloid branch of humanity. No remains of pecking man, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, or any other archaic form of our genus have ever been discovered in this hemisphere. Since no indisputably last interglacial artifacts have come to light in North or South America, we may surmise that humans entered Alaska at the earliest during the Wisconsin, both by land and by sea. Certain finds tend to back up the long chronology for human entry into the hemisphere. At At Vasaquillo, near Puebla in southern Mexico, Cynthia Irwin Williams found cultural remains associated with an extinct fauna which included mammoth, mastodon, horse, antelope, dire wolf, and smaller mammals. The lack of bifacially worked projectile points suggests an early date, supported by a single radiocarbon determination of about 21,000 years ago. In the Valley of Mexico itself, dates ranging from 21,000 to 24,000 years ago are possible at the island of Tlapacoya for a crude industry of choppers, scrapers, flakes, and a blade in Burin. The New World must have been an untouched paradise for the first hunting people. Extensive herds of large grazing animals such as mammoths, mastodons, camels, horses, and giant bison roamed through both subcontinents. With ideal conditions such as these, population expansion and spread were probably fairly rapid. Radiocarbon dating has demonstrated that people were hunting sloth, horse, and guanaco at the Straits of Magellan by at least 10,000 BC, and Tom de la Haye's work at Monteverde, Chile, has produced compelling evidence for a significantly older occupation at 12,500 BC. To understand the significance of finds of the late Pleistocene date that have been made in Mexico, it is necessary to consider them in the light of the early hunter stage as we now know it for North America as a whole, especially for the United States, where research on this problem has been most intensive. The opinion of many New World archaeologists is that the earliest known remains are those of a very simple culture of hunters and gatherers in which the majority of tools were inconceivably crude, percussion-chipped pebble artifacts. Coarse choppers, chopping tools, scrapers, and knives are found at a number of campsites and open stations in the western United States under conditions of seemingly great antiquity, since this rudimentary inventory is exactly that of the late Pleistocene population of East Asia. It is believed to represent the non-perishable part of the toolkits of the first immigrants. By approximately 11,000 BC, an immense technological change had taken place, with the introduction or invention of fine percussion and pressure flake stone points of the type known as clovis. These have, extending up from the base on one or both sides, a broad channel or flute formed by the removal of long, narrow flakes by a technique that is not yet well understood. Clovis points are found over much of North America, from Alaska down to Panama. Some significant specimens come from the mammoth kill sites in Arizona near the Mexican border. In the American Midwest and West, at about 10,300 BC, a refinement in fluting produced the well-known Folsom point. Specimens of this type supersede Clovis and are often associated with bison kills. All these points, because of their size and weight, are considered to be the business end of spears which were hurled with the aid of a spear thrower, or atlatl, to use the Nahuatl term. Experiments carried out by Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institution have shown the high efficiency of this weaponry over the handheld spear. The atlatl hurled spear has 15 times the speed and 200 times the impact. It comes as no surprise that the atlatl stayed in favor until the Spanish conquest. The bow and arrow was a late arrival in Mexico and was not adopted at all in many areas. Concurrently with Folsom, in the Great Plains as far south as Texas appeared a number of related industries, all characterized by bifacially chipped lanceolate points, Angostura, Scottsbluff, etc. In actuality, this lanceolate point horizon covers most of Latin America as well. The origin of the techniques and concepts involved in the production of bifacially chipped spear points in this hemisphere is not known, although some have looked to the Old World where very similar industries have existed from a much earlier time level. Of course, all of the above-mentioned tool inventories were the equipment of peoples who were without agriculture and who lived mainly by the chase and gathering of wild plant foods. From what we know about still extant societies with a similar way of life, such as the Australian Aborigines, concentrations of population larger than the small band were quite impossible. The late Edward Davy once estimated that on this level of development, corresponding roughly to the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, 25 square miles or 65 square kilometers of territory are required for the support of one person. In all the New World prior to 7000 BC, there may never have been at any one moment in time more than 500,000 persons, with about 30,000 of these in Mexico, a crude guess to be sure, but not unreasonable. Late Pleistocene Mexico presented a landscape considerably different from that which we see at the present. Rain poured then on places where it hardly touches today, and many semi-deserts have been those in remote times a sea of grass. The Great Lake in the Valley of Mexico, where the most significant finds of the early hunter stage have been found, was a great deal broader and deeper, as testified by old strand lines on the surrounding hills. A single spear point of the Clovis type of quartzite, about 2 inches or 5 centimeters long, was found on the surface of the Weicker Ranch, some 30 miles or 48 kilometers west of the city of Durango in northwest Mexico. Like all Clovis specimens, this is a fluted point fashioned by a combination of percussion and pressure flaking, and shows the characteristic dulling of the edges at the sides and base, presumably to prevent abrasion of the lashing by which it was bound to the shaft. By analogy with radiocarbon-dated Clovis sites in the United States, this artifact represents an occupation of Mexico as early as the 11th millennium BC. Freshwater sediments over 250 feet or 75 meters thick underlie Mexico City and all of the areas of the now dry beads of the Great Lake in the Valley of Mexico. Geological work has established a stratigraphy for the upper part of these deposits that correspond to the later part of the Pleistocene and all the post-Pleistocene climatic sequence. Crucial to the problem of the ancient occupation in the valley is the Becerra Formation, divided into an upper and a lower. The latter probably pertains to the early or middle Wisconsin stage, while the upper Becerra Formation can be assigned with some confidence to the Valdez Advance of the late Wisconsin, between 11,000 and 8,000 BC, on the basis of a single radiocarbon date and the kind of artifacts associated with this stratum. The upper Becerra is a fine green muck and has lenses of ash deposited by the volcanoes that were then in frequent eruption. Over this is a layer of brown, sandy sediments that were deposited at a time when the Great Lake was shrinking. Presumably, this layer represents the first part of the warmer period, known as the hypsothermal period, interval, broken by a sudden readvance of the ice sheet in Canada about 6000 BC. A turn to really dry conditions and desiccation of the lake bed is indicated by a layer of caliche, or calcium carbonate, marking the climax of the hypsothermal. From the caliche layer to the surface are several layers which probably date from the late hypsothermal to modern times, and which contain abundant potsherds. As long ago as 1870, Mexican naturalist Mariano Barcena discovered the sacrum of an extinct camelid, which had been carved to represent the head of an animal, apparently a large member of the dog family, at the locality of Tequixquiac, 42 miles or 67 kilometers north of Mexico City. This specimen lay at a depth of 40 feet or 12 meters below the surface in deposits of unknown age. One can only indulge in guesswork, but several other lesser finds at Tequixquiac in subsequent years have been ascribed to the base of the upper Becerra Formation, and the carved sacrum may well have been found in this layer. Few finds in Mexico have aroused such general interest as the famous Tepexpan man, in fact a woman. In 1949, the geologist Helma de Terra was engaged in a search for mammoth skeletons in the vicinity of Tepexpan, on the northeastern edge of the old beds of Lake Texcoco, a locality known to be rich in Pleistocene fossils. Almost as an accidental byproduct of his survey, a human skeleton was exposed in one trench. Tepexpan man appears to have been deliberately buried by her fellows, face down and with the legs drawn up under the body, unaccompanied by any offerings. According to a study by Santiago Genovese, the dead person was a woman of no more than 30 years of age, about 5 foot 3 inches or 160 centimeters tall, and not particularly different from Mexican Indians in general. The major problem, it should be unequivocally stressed, is the actual stratigraphic position of the skeleton when discovered. According to De Terra, it was found in the Upper Bursera Formation, a stratum known to have fossil elephant remains as well, and underlying the caliche. Unfortunately, the inept handling of the excavation makes it unlikely that we shall ever know whether this was so or not. As Marie Warmington has pointed out, the type of burial represented by the Tepeshpan woman suggests the subsequent archaic period, when flexed, unaccompanied interments are common, at least in the United States. However, fluorine tests have pretty well demonstrated the contemporaneity of the skeleton with mammalian fossils known to be of Upper Bursera age. The Tepeshpan woman may be our first Mexican, after all. Far more satisfactory and less enigmatic results have been obtained on the old lake flats near Santa Isabel Ixtapan, only a few miles out of Tepeshpan. In 1952, Mexican prehistorians, following up a chance find by workers opening a drainage ditch, excavated the skeleton of an imperial mammoth, Mammothus imperator, which lay entirely within the green muck of the Upper Bursera Formation, and which was therefore Valders in age. The animal had been butchered in situ, a fact that could be deduced from the disarticulated position of the bones alone. Most importantly, 6 human artifacts were indisputably associated with the skeleton. These included a flint projectile of the type known as Scott's Bluff, one of the most widely distributed artifacts of lanceolate point horizon on the Great Plains of the United States. The other artifacts were utilized in cutting up the mammoth and comprised of a scraper, knife, and fine primalistic blade, all of obsidian, and an end scraper and retouched blade of flint. In 1954, the construction of another ditch by the Santa Isabel Iztapan villagers resulted in the lucky find of a second mammoth kill, again with artifacts that had been lost during the butchering process. Here the hind leg of the animal had been cut in the Upper Bursera muck, probably as it was fleeing its human pursuers. During the butchering process, the head and tusks had been dragged back across the body, and some bones showed deep cuts made by stone knives while the meat was being hacked off. 3 chipstone artifacts found among the bones comprise an Angostura point of a dark, ingenious material, a lerma point of flint, and a chert, bifacially worked knife. The first 2 named are of some interest. Angostura points can also be ascribed to the lanceolate point horizon on the Great Plains, known to be later than the Clovis horizon. Lerma points have an even wider spread in the late Wisconsin glacial, being found in Texas and northeastern Mexico, where they appear as early as 8000 BC, and are one of the most common types of point ascribed to the early hunter stage in South America as far as Argentina. We have no radiocarbon dates on the Santa Isabel Iztapan finds, but charcoal from a hearth next to a skeleton of still another slaughtered mammoth in the same formation has been dated to 9200 BC by this process. We can reconstruct something of the life and environment of these lacustrine hunters of the Valley of Mexico some 11,000 years ago. Although it must be remembered that we lack all knowledge of their campsites and have the chance evidence only of their hunting prowess. The climate was more humid and cooler than that of today. In fact, the now barren outskirts of the valley were covered in pine forests. In the distance, the young cones of the active volcanoes poured out smoke, ash, and lava, perhaps disturbing the tempo of life in the valley from time to time, but not seriously disrupting it. The Imperial Mammoth seems to have favored the swampy margins of the wide, shallow lake. These beasts must have been relatively easy game to organize groups of hunters who, armed with spears hurled from atlatls and equipped with stone knives and other butchering tools, drove the heavy beasts into shallower water where they became hopelessly mired in the treacherous lake bottom. There each mammoth was isolated and dispatched, although probably not without danger, since the risk of impalements by the formidable tusks of the surrounded animal must have been considerable. To kill any elephant with spears would require pluck. On the northeastern frontier of Mexico, in the state of Tamaulipas, Richard S. McNeish revealed in his excavations a long cultural sequence that begins with our primitive early hunters. The earliest of these phases, the Diablo complex, is of some simplicity, comprising only crude, bifacially flaked and unifist tools made from flints or pebbles, choppers, ovoid blades, pebble end scrapers, and crude flake side scrapers suggest an unspecialized hunting and gathering way of life on the most rudimentary level. Since these artifacts are found in a high terrace of the canyon Diablo, formed when the river was running very much higher and the climate was obviously much wetter than today, McNeish has suggested that the Diablo complex is contemporaneous with the Mankato advance of the Wisconsin between 13,500 and 12,000 BC. A far better picture of Ice Age life in Mexico comes from the Tehuacan Valley in Puebla, where a large-scale project directed by McNeish disclosed a late Pleistocene occupation called the Ahuejarado phase. Radiocarbon dates suggest that it ended before 8000 BC, but it must have been part coeval with the Iztapan kills. The evidence shows that the climate was cooler and drier than that now prevailing, with open steppe covering the valley floor. In this setting grazed subsequently extinct horse and pronghorn antelope, which were hunted with spears fitted with lemur points. The inhabitants also sought smaller game such as jackrabbits, gophers, and rats. The tool technology was totally based upon chipped stone. In addition to projectile points, there were knives, choppers, side scrapers for dressing hides, and crude blades. Ground stone tools, which could have been used to prepare vegetable foods, are absent, although some wild plants such as prickly pear cactus and setaria grass were surely harvested by crew means. The inhabitants of Tehuacan during Ahuejarado times, for that one, were probably grouped into about 3 nomadic families or microbands of 4 to 8 people each. And the evidence of cave floor occupation shows that camps were changed 3 or 4 times a season, since there never was enough food in any one ecological niche to support settled life, a state of affairs which also prevailed throughout the succeeding Archaic stage. It would be a dangerous misconception to consider this period, viewed as a whole, as merely the time when people hunted huge Pleistocene animals such as mammoth, horse, and so forth. As a matter of fact, in actual habitation sites of this date in Texas and elsewhere in the United States, the vast majority of animal bones and remains come from relatively small animals, as humble as rodents, snakes, snails, and mussels. These people gathered and ate everything that was edible, and probably had to survive some very lean seasons. Since most of the sites that we have are large and conspicuous kills, we have been deluded into thinking that we are dealing with some sort of ancient big-game hunters who disdain smaller animals or plant foods. True, larger herbivores were slaughtered, but from this we must not assume that the late Pleistocene was a time of plenty. Like the modern pygmies of the African rainforest, who also hunt elephants, success in the chase probably meant a short feast marked by voracious gluttony, with long intervals of eating whatever they could lay their hands on.